If you look at Matthew McConaughey with his radiant smile, warm eyes, and calm demeanor, you would never imagine that inside this man is a soul not merely damaged, but annihilated by memories so horrific they still claw at him in the dead of night. At the age of 15, when he should have been tasting first love under Texas starlight, when innocence should have bloomed like wildflowers after spring rain, he was subjected to blackmail and abuse so cruel, so devastating, that his youth wasn't just darkened, it was murdered. The boy who should have been discovering himself was instead learning that the world could be a predator, that trust could be weaponized, that his own body could become a battlefield he didn't know how to defend. 3 years later, when he turned 18 and should have been celebrating the threshold of manhood, the tragedy struck again with even more savage cruelty. Matthew was knocked unconscious and attacked by a man in a van, a metallic tomb where his dignity was buried alive, turning his youth into an endless series of days lived with guilt so heavy it crushed his chest, fear so paralyzing it stole his breath, and shame so profound it rewrote his very identity. Unable to bear the weight of existing in a place where every street corner whispered reminders of his violation, he fled America entirely, escaping to Australia as if an ocean could drown the ghosts hunting his every waking moment. But you cannot outrun your own shadow. You cannot exile your own memories. And Matthew would learn that distance only amplifies the echo of trauma. Just when it seemed he had clawed his way from that abyss, when Hollywood's golden doors swung open and fame promised salvation, he was dragged into another hell. And this time the demon wore the face of the woman who gave him life. His mother, Mary Kathleen Kay McConaughey, became the greatest obsession and deepest wound of his existence. She was suffocatingly possessive, forcing him to share her bed even as an adult, clinging to him like he was still umbilically attached, as if his independence was a betrayal she could not forgive. And when he became a star, when the world fell in love with him, she weaponized his most private secrets on television, parading his childhood bedroom to journalists, broadcasting intimate details as if his life was her trophy, her entertainment, her property. Matthew had to make the most excruciating decision of his life, cutting off contact with his mother for 8 agonizing years, carrying emotional wounds so deep that wealth, fame, and even marital happiness could not heal them. Now at 55, Matthew still carries the shadows of his past like ghosts that never leave, suffering from anxiety and depression severe enough to require ongoing therapy, sleepless nights where he wakes drenched in cold sweat, heart hammering against ribs like a prisoner against cell bars, rendering the $160 million and the Oscar and the perfect family almost meaningless because you cannot purchase peace when war lies inside your own mind. To fully understand Matthew McConaughey's tragedy, we must descend into the origin of the wound, his childhood, where every scar was carved with precision, where love and violence became so intertwined they were indistinguishable. Matthew David McConaughey was born on November 4th, 1969, the youngest of 3 siblings in the small town of Uvalde, Texas, a place so small it could fit inside a single breath, where he grew up swallowing oil smoke, enduring blazing sun that baked the earth until it cracked, and witnessing his parents' love story, which wasn't a romance, but a war with no ceasefire, no peace treaty, only temporary truces before the next battle. His father, Jim McConaughey, had been a football player, all muscle and masculinity, a man who spoke through action rather than words, who believed discipline was spelled with a closed fist and lessons were taught through pain. His mother, Mary Kathleen, was a smart and ferociously strong-willed kindergarten teacher whose love felt more like possession, whose affection came wrapped in control. They loved each other so intensely, so violently, that they could not exist peacefully in the same space, divorcing twice and remarrying 3 times as if their lives could only exist in a cycle of breaking and mending, destruction and resurrection, as if love for them was not about harmony, but about the addictive pattern of falling apart and desperately clawing back together. McConaughey once said with a voice heavy from carrying those memories, "My parents loved fiercely, fought fiercely, and lived fiercely. And to him, his childhood home was not peaceful like in family movies where problems resolve in 30 minutes. It was not a sanctuary where children felt safe. It was a combat zone where laughter and slamming doors rang out simultaneously, where love and anger were not opposites but twins, where violence and tenderness sat at the same breakfast table, pretending yesterday's screaming match never happened. Kate recalled with disturbing nostalgia that her 3 marriages to Jim took place in 3 different churches, Presbyterian, Catholic, and then Methodist. We loved each other madly, but could also kill each other with a look, she said, as if attempted emotional murder was romantic, as if toxicity was just passion by another name. McConaughey vividly remembered the times his parents fought with such ferocity that furniture became weapons. Phones were hurled across rooms. Tears flooded the kitchen floor. Voices reached decibels that made the walls shake, but strangely, impossibly. The next morning they would sit together for breakfast, laughing as if nothing had happened, as if last night's apocalypse was just weather that passed. That was their language of love, contradictory, violent, but somehow genuine in its refusal to give up despite the damage they inflicted on each other and on the children who watched, absorbed, internalized every pattern. Amid those battles, it was his mother who planted his first seed of belief, the first whisper that he could be more than his circumstances. In 1977, she signed him up for the Little Mr. Texas contest in Bandera, and when Matthew won, she didn't just celebrate, she consecrated the moment like it was a religious experience. She framed the photograph and hung it in the kitchen like an icon, and every single morning she would point to it with the fervor of a prophet delivering divine truth and say, "Look, you are the winner, Little Mr. Texas," drilling it into his consciousness until belief became bone, until identity was established not by reality, but by relentless repetition. Only later did Matthew realize that the title was not official, that it was essentially meaningless, a small-town charade, but his mother's words worked like alchemy, teaching him that you become what you believe, that fiction becomes truth when conviction is strong enough, that reality bends to the will of those stubborn enough to refuse alternative narratives. Discipline in the McConaughey household was not guidance. It was brutal education where mistakes were punished with pain. When Matthew uttered a curse word, punishment descended immediately, swift and merciless. Returning home at 10 p.m. with a temporary tattoo on his arm, his father would strike him without hesitation, teaching him that rebellion had a price written in bruises, that autonomy was a privilege that had to be earned through submission. And when he dared complain about old sneakers, his mother would stare straight into his eyes with a look that could freeze blood and say with ice in her voice, "Go ahead, complain. I'll take you to meet the kid with no legs," weaponizing gratitude, turning legitimate needs into moral failures, teaching him that a want was to be ungrateful, that to need was to be weak. Then came the moment that split Matthew's life into before and after, the first death of innocence that would haunt him for decades. The first tragedy struck when McConaughey was 15 years old, at that tender age when boys should be awkwardly navigating first kisses, when the biggest concerns should be acne and whether that girl in algebra class notices you. But in the small town of Uvalde, where everyone knew each other, where secrets were supposed to be impossible, someone used threats and psychological manipulation to force Matthew into his first sexual experience, turning what should have been a moment of discovery into a trauma that would poison his relationship with his own body for years. You stand there, heart pounding, feeling like the world is collapsing beneath your feet. He wrote decades later in his memoir Greenlights with a tone that still bled despite the passage of time, despite the therapy, despite everything. I thought I was going to hell, and that wasn't metaphor. That was genuine terror, because the family's strict religious foundation with sermons about sin and purity and God's judgment had taught him that his body was sacred, that sexuality outside specific boundaries was damnation, and now he believed his soul was forfeit, that he was fundamentally unclean, fundamentally unworthy of love or salvation or even existence. In the following days, Matthew stayed silent, building walls around the wound because he told himself he had to be strong, that real men don't break, that real men say, all right, all right, all right, That phrase, which would later become his signature, was born not from confidence, but from a traumatized teenager's desperate attempt to convince himself he could survive this. But inside, the shame was a deep cut that bled endlessly, never clotting, never healing. He began blaming himself, interrogating every action, every word, every breath, asking the questions that trauma victims torture themselves with. What did I do wrong? Did I cause this? Did I invite this somehow? Am I broken? Am I dirty? Am I still worthy of being loved? Long Texas nights under the dim moonlight became torture chambers where Matthew lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying desperately to shake off the images and feelings, try to scrub his mind clean, trying to reclaim ownership of a body that no longer felt like his. But they clung to him like a shadow he could not outrun, like a stain he could not wash away, like a ghost that lived inside his own skin. 3 years later, just as he turned 18, just as he should have been celebrating legal adulthood, stepping into freedom, darkness struck again with even more savage cruelty, proving that fate had not finished destroying him, that the universe had more lessons in helplessness to teach. One evening, on a deserted street corner where screams dissolve into emptiness, Matthew was attacked by a stranger, knocked unconscious, his agency stolen in an instant, dragged into a van and abused while his mind floated somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. When he woke, his body ached with pain that went beyond physical, his mind was in complete turmoil, and he felt torn apart not just physically but existentially, as if his very humanity had been shredded. I didn't know where I was or why this was happening. He once shared in a rare moment of openness that must have cost him everything to speak aloud. He staggered home, clothes disheveled, body violated, soul shattered into fragments too small to piece back together. The helplessness and humiliation crushed him as if the whole world was mocking his weakness, as if he was fundamentally incapable of protecting himself, as if he was prey and would always be prey. Those wounds never fully healed because some traumas don't heal. They just become part of your architecture, structural damage you learn to live with. They became red lights in his life, warning signals that would flash whenever intimacy approached, whenever trust was required, whenever vulnerability was demanded. At 18, when he should have been enjoying the freedom of youth, when college should have been about discovery and possibility, Matthew struggled with the sense of betrayal by his own body and by fate itself. He began asking questions that had no satisfying answers. Can I trust anyone? Am I still myself? Will I ever feel safe again? Will I ever feel clean? Those questions echoed in his mind during lectures, during meals, during every moment of silence. But he could not find immediate answers because trauma doesn't resolve on a schedule. Healing doesn't follow a timeline. In the following years, Matthew carried that pain like luggage he could never set down into his journey of growing up, into his attempt to build an identity from the wreckage. He left Texas for Australia as an exchange student, hoping that distance would soothe his soul, that new landscapes would somehow rewrite his interior geography, that he could become someone new if he went somewhere no one knew the broken version of him. But the shame lingered like a smell he couldn't wash off, appearing in dreams that jerked him awake gasping, in solitary moments when his mind wandered to places he tried desperately to avoid. He learned to hide it with a skill that would later serve him as an actor, to wear a radiant smile that reached his eyes, to speak with the confidence that would later captivate Hollywood. But deep inside, he still struggled with feeling unworthy, still believed what happened was his fault, still carried guilt that had no logical basis, but felt as real as gravity. I had to learn to forgive myself, he wrote years later, and that was the longest journey I've ever taken. But in Australia, reality was much colder than he imagined, healing much harder than distance suggested. He arrived in Warner Vale, a small insular town that felt like the edge of existence, and lived with a strict Dolly family where every meal was a moral lecture, where warmth was absent, where every silence felt like judgment. The boy who had grown up in volcanic chaos was now trapped in suffocating ice, and neither extreme allowed him to simply exist. Friends disappeared because making connections required an openness he no longer possessed. The sea was gone, and even laughter became unfamiliar, a sound other people made that he had forgotten how to produce authentically. Later, Matthew admitted with brutal honesty, "Before Australia, I had never been introspective, but there I had to face myself." And facing himself meant confronting every demon he had been running from, meant sitting with the pain instead of outrunning it, meant acknowledging that he was profoundly damaged and that denial was no longer sustainable. He was too poor to go out, surviving on wilted lettuce with ketchup, meals so meager that his ribs showed beneath a thin shirt, his body literally wasting away as if the physical form was mirroring the internal decay. During the day, he took any job he could find: unpaid bank clerk, legal assistant, mechanic, construction worker, even a golf caddy chasing stray balls across perfectly manicured greens. Any work that would exhaust him enough that sleep might come without nightmares. When the Doley family's coldness became unbearable, when their judgment felt like another form of abuse, Matthew's anger erupted like a fire long suppressed, like a volcano that had been building pressure for years. He smashed doors, fists trembling, breathing ragged with frustration and longing for freedom, for the right to exist without constant evaluation. Without a word of explanation, he packed his belongings in silence and stepped out into the night, carrying only one thing that mattered: his self-respect, the one possession that couldn't be stolen unless he surrendered it willingly. Back in his homeland, Matthew chose the safe path that parents approve of, enrolling in law at the University of Texas in Austin, following the Scripps Society rights for young men from small towns. While his friends dreamed of courtrooms and justice, he felt suffocated, as if trapped in a box too small for his expansive soul, as if he was slowly dying in a profession designed for someone else's life. In quiet nights, he opened a journal, writing little stories and sketching characters, and there he was free. There he could breathe. There he could be whoever he wanted without judgment or expectation. After graduating in 1993, McConaughey started with small roles that nobody remembered, commercials that vanished into the void, auditions that led nowhere, rejection after rejection, teaching him that talent without opportunity is just potential that dies slowly. Until one day, opportunity struck like lightning. The role of David Wooderson in Dazed and Confused, just a few minutes on screen, but minutes that would change everything. With a nonchalant smile and an improvisational line that came from somewhere deep in his survival instinct. All right, all right, all right. He became a phenomenon. That phrase, born from a traumatized teenager trying to convince himself he was okay now, became the calling card of a star. No one expected that that very first line would open a journey lasting decades, that those 3 words would become more famous than entire films. Yet, light always comes with shadow, and just 5 days after filming wrapped, his phone rang in the middle of the night with the kind of call that shatters you, the kind of news that proves happiness is always borrowed, never owned. On the other end was devastating news that would haunt him for years. His father, Jim McConaughey, had suddenly passed away from a heart attack. The man who had taught him resilience through brutality, honesty even when it hurt, and the courage to pursue dreams even when everyone says you're crazy, was gone forever, stolen in an instant. Matthew left the set in shock, returning to Houston in silence, so profound it felt like drowning. And there, among family and friends offering hollow condolences, only a vast emptiness remained, a hole in reality that could never be filled. Standing by his father's coffin, he realized with crushing finality that the person who had pushed him hardest, who had believed in him even when discipline looked like cruelty, would never see his first success, would never know that the boy he raised became someone the world would love. 3 years later, McConaughey rose to stardom with the role of lawyer Jake Brigance in A Time to Kill in 1996, and it was the first time Hollywood saw not only his Southern charm, not only his perfect smile, but also the emotional depth of someone who could carry a film with his eyes in silence, someone who understood pain so intimately that he could communicate it without words. He then continued to establish himself with Contact and Amistad, quickly becoming a top choice for major directors who recognized that beneath the pretty face was an artist capable of profound work. At this point, McConaughey stepped into the glamorous universe of fame, lights and red carpets, and smiles flashing for cameras. But it was also this light that gradually boxed him in, trapped him in an image that felt increasingly like a cage. In the early 2000s, he became the face of romantic comedies. The Wedding Planner, How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, Failure to Launch, Fool's Gold, movie after movie where he played essentially the same character. The charming guy with the perfect smile who gets the girl in exactly the way audiences expect. People loved him for his smile, for his sun-kissed body, for his roguish style that felt effortless. But he himself felt trapped, suffocating, dying slowly inside the prison of other people's expectations. "I didn't want to just be the pretty guy in predictable movies," he once said with frustration still evident in his voice decades later. When his fame peaked, when he could have coasted on easy money and guaranteed success, he decided to step back, to commit what Hollywood considered career suicide. He rejected dozens of scripts, disappearing from screens for nearly 2 years, a risky move few dare to make in an industry that forgets you the moment you stop being visible. Then, at age 36, at the height of fame when most actors would cling desperately to relevance, Matthew did what no one dared. He stopped completely, said no to easy scripts, turned down millions to find himself again, to remember why he started acting in the first place. For nearly 2 years, Matthew's house was silent. The phone never rang with offers. The mailbox remained empty of scripts, and Hollywood whispered that he was finished, that he had made a fatal mistake, that he would be forgotten. Piles of scripts outside his door disappeared without a trace, because word spread that McConaughey was turning everything down, that he was somehow broken or difficult or no longer interested. Friends and colleagues warned that he was pushing himself out of the light, that this silence was career suicide, that he would never recover from this self-imposed exile. But Matthew did not react, did not justify his choices, did not beg for validation. He simply existed in the quiet, doing the internal work that Hollywood doesn't understand because it can't be monetized. At that time, Matthew was also suffering from a completely different wound. His relationship with his mother had become toxic, unbearable, another trauma layered on top of childhood abuse. After he became a Hollywood star, his mother, Kay McConaughey, began oversharing with the media, turning his personal stories into entertainment, giving tours of corners of his childhood home, even leading reporters to his bedroom, as if his privacy was currency she could spend to purchase her own fame. "I only knew when I saw my house on TV," he recalled with barely concealed pain, discovering his betrayal not through conversation but through broadcast television. Feeling betrayed at the deepest level, Matthew made a difficult decision that would haunt him for years: to cut contact with his mother for nearly 8 years from around 2001 to 2009, to amputate the woman who gave him life because she had become another source of trauma he had to survive. He said in an interview, with a heaviness that spoke volumes, "We still called each other on Sundays, but only exchanged a few words. I had to keep distance to protect myself, because sometimes love,